A dream of happiness. Emily Carter had always imagined her life in shades of hope. She grew up in a modest suburb of Seattle, raised by her aunt and uncle after losing both parents in a car accident as a child. Her family wasn't wealthy, but Emily's upbringing was grounded in decency, resilience, and quiet ambition. She excelled at school, worked part-time at a local bookstore, and harbored the classic American dream that hard work and faith in herself would bring her something beautiful. At 25, Emily landed a marketing job at a respected tech startup. The office was a sleek downtown space, its glass walls reflecting a city alive with ambition. It was there, outside the boardroom one rainy Thursday, that she met Andrew Harrington. He was charming, impressive in a well-tailored suit, with an easy smile and a confidence that radiated success. Andrew, just a few years older, came from an old money family, known for their investments and philanthropic presence in the city. Their relationship blossomed at a dizzying pace. Andrew swept Emily off her feet with dinners at award-winning restaurants, spontaneous weekend trips, and little gifts that reminded her of her worth. For the first time, Emily felt truly seen. Andrew listened to her stories, laughed at her jokes, and whispered reassurances about a future together. His world was one of luxury and promise, a world she'd only glimpsed in movies, now suddenly within her reach. 6 months after they met, Andrew proposed in Central Park during a weekend trip to New York. He knelt beneath the cherry blossoms, presenting a sapphire ring that sparkled against the spring sky. Emily, overwhelmed with joy and gratitude, said yes through tears. She called her aunt, stunned and elated, promising to visit home soon. The wedding was nothing short of spectacular. Held in a historic waterfront mansion, the ceremony was attended by Seattle's elite, politicians, business magnates, and glittering socialites. Emily's dress, custom-made in Paris, floated behind her as she walked toward Andrew, who grinned nervously at the altar. Margaret, Andrew's mother, orchestrated every detail with perfectionist zeal, ensuring the day looked like something off the cover of a bridal magazine. In the days that followed, Emily moved into the Harrington family estate, a sprawling, ivy-draped home perched on Lake Washington's edge. She traded her studio apartment for sun-drenched rooms and views of sailboats gliding over water. Staff greeted her in the mornings. Gourmet breakfasts appeared on the table. At first, she could hardly believe her luck. Andrew introduced Emily to a new set of friends, people who spoke in stock tips and vacationed on private islands. Parties were lavish, the conversation sparkling, and there was always the unspoken promise of opportunity for those who fit in. For Emily, these gatherings felt both exhilarating and intimidating. She smiled bright, projecting confidence while trying to commit hundreds of new names and stories to memory. Amidst all the glitz, Emily clung to Andrew's affection. Their laughter during late-night strolls, the warmth of his arms around her as they watched old movies. These simple moments reassured her she belonged. Andrew promised her a future full of happiness, children playing in the garden, shared dreams, and endless support. And though Margaret's gaze was sometimes cool and appraising, Emily dismissed it as the reserve of a woman who had weathered decades in high society. As Emily settled into her new role as Mrs. Harrington, she marveled at her transformation. Friends from her old life called and visited. She gushed about her happiness, the new opportunities, and the comfort of feeling safe and cherished at last. In her heart, Emily believed this was her happy ending, the dream she'd built her life around. The possibility of shadows behind the golden light never crossed her mind. The first red flags. The first signs that not everything was perfect in Emily's newfound paradise came quietly. Too subtle at first to shatter her illusions, but enough to cause small ripples of anxiety in the days that followed the wedding. It started with the house. Emily was eager to settle into the Harrington estate, envisioning herself making small changes to turn it into a home. Maybe placing her favorite novels on the living room shelves, or hanging framed photographs of her family in the hall. The first weekend, she brought a box of her belongings downstairs, planning to decorate the cozy library off the main hall. But as she arranged a framed picture of her parents, Margaret Harrington appeared in the doorway. Her smile was polite, almost gracious, but her eyes scanned the photograph with a brief flicker of disapproval. "Oh, honey, I see you're making yourself at home," Margaret said, her tone as carefully measured as her pearls. "Let's be sure we honor the history of this house. These rooms have always kept to a certain style. It would be a shame to disrupt the flow. Why don't we put those away for now?" The words were gentle, but the command was clear. Emily smiled, obediently tucking her parents' photograph back in the box, trying to convince herself it was a small sacrifice. There would be other spaces, she reasoned. But over the coming days, every effort Emily made to personalize her life was quietly steered, redirected, or subtly erased. Margaret's presence grew ever present. She joined Andrew and Emily for breakfast most mornings, always seeming to have a new request, reminders about the staff, comments on what Emily should or shouldn't wear, suggestions to freshen up a bit before guests arrived. Emily noticed that even the clothes Margaret gifted her were conservative, muted, nothing like the cheerful colors she preferred. On one occasion, Margaret mentioned a charity gala and handed Emily a dress to wear, icy blue and elegant, but 2 sizes too large. "It's about the family image," Margaret said softly. "You'll look so refined by Andrew's side." Andrew laughed it off, but Emily felt the sting. Then there were the rules, the small but growing boundaries pressed around Emily's independence. When Emily suggested Andrew invite her college friends over for a dinner party, Margaret intervened, explaining how family gatherings at the estate were typically reserved for close relatives and a select set of acquaintances. "We like to keep things intimate and appropriate," Margaret insisted, with a practiced smile. Andrew, unsure, shrugged and changed the topic. His passivity stung, a quiet thread pulling at Emily's patience. Andrew, for his part, seemed caught between loyalties. He adored his mother, often describing how she had held the family together through financial turbulence and social scrutiny. When Emily gently confronted him about Margaret's interventions, he reassured her with a laugh. "She just gets intense about the family sometimes. It's her way of caring. It'll get easier. Trust me." He was loving, kissing her on the forehead and promising they would find their own rhythm soon. But Emily noticed that with every conversation, Andrew deferred to his mother's wishes: where to eat, how to host parties, even what time to turn in at night. The boundaries continued to close in. Emily's work schedule, once something she cherished, became another battleground. Margaret would appear in the kitchen on weekday mornings and suggest that the family would benefit so much more if you focused on affairs closer to home. There were subtle hints that her career isn't suitable for a Harrington wife, with veiled remarks like, "A real lady doesn't need an office job to feel fulfilled." Andrew didn't oppose his mother, only suggesting they could revisit the discussion later. Emily felt a pang of loss, as if pieces of her life were being traded away for an unfamiliar version of happiness. Emily's phone calls with her aunt and friends grew shorter. Margaret would appear at the door or ask her to join an impromptu meeting just as Emily tried to connect with the outside world. Even outings were orchestrated. Margaret would join, politely but persistently, inserting herself into every plan. By the end of the first month, Emily could not ignore the pattern. Her sense of freedom, once so vital, was being chipped away under a mask of tradition and family honor. She lay awake at night beside Andrew, searching for the words to explain the subtle unease shadowing her every day. As she stared at the moonlit ceiling, one worry rose above the others. A silent question she was only beginning to ask herself. How much must she sacrifice to remain a part of this family? Emily wanted desperately to believe that love alone would fix these small fissures, that compromise was a natural part of marriage. But in her quiet moments, a cold seed of doubt began to grow. For the first time, Emily wondered whether the dream she had chased was already slipping out of reach, replaced by something far less kind, and whether anyone else could see the warning signs she did. Family chains. The weeks passed, and what once felt like gentle nudges from Margaret Harrington began to tighten, transforming into deliberate controls that shaped every corner of Emily's new life. What started as subtle suggestions, how to dress, where to place things, whom to socialize with, soon evolved into open interference in the most private areas of Emily's world. Margaret had a talent for cloaking her commands in concern. At breakfast, she would inquire about Emily's plans for the day, only to subtly redirect them. Don't exhaust yourself. Why not skip that office meeting and join me for the charity luncheon? Or, wouldn't it be lovely for you to start managing the household accounts? It'll help you settle into your role here. There was rarely space in these conversations for Emily's preferences. If she politely declined, she met with Margaret's disappointed sighs, or worse, long stretches of silence that made the walls of the estate feel colder. Andrew, meanwhile, had shifted from enthusiastic partner to passive observer. In the early weeks, he had seemed softly apologetic for his mother's intrusions. But as time went on, he simply complied. Mom just wants what's best, Em. If it makes her happy, can't we just go along? Emily tried to reason with him, explaining how each choice that was wrested away chipped at her identity. But Andrew responded with practiced rationalizations, brushing her concerns aside. Gradually, Emily felt like her marriage, not just the estate, was managed by another's invisible hand. Tension simmered endlessly beneath the surface. Emily found herself second-guessing every word, every action, questioning whether she'd unwittingly given offense. Decisions about the household, from what food to serve to which paintings to hang, were no longer hers. Margaret had opinions on everything, down to Emily's friendships. When Emily suggested inviting coworkers over for dinner, Margaret vetoed the idea, voicing concern about propriety. We do need to uphold the Harrington name, after all, she cautioned, with a note of warning masked behind the veneer of a smile. It wasn't just about traditions, Emily realized. It was about control. The house staff, once friendly, now reported to Margaret before responding to Emily's requests. Subtle reminders from the housekeeper, Mrs. Harrington asked me to check with her first, became increasingly frequent. Emily's world shrank. Familiar faces from her past stopped visiting, often explaining that scheduling had become complicated. Calls to her aunt and childhood friends were interrupted. Margaret seemed to materialize, hovering at the door or quietly taking a seat nearby. Sometimes Emily suspected these timings were no accident. Social events, too, became trials. At parties, Margaret would introduce Emily not as a vibrant, accomplished individual, but as our lovely new addition to the family. Andrew, standing beside them, laughed and accepted praise on his mother's behalf, rarely defending Emily's boundaries. Conversations with other guests were closely monitored, and any attempts by Emily to stray outside of accepted topics were subtly redirected. Inside, Emily's loneliness swelled. The estate, vast and beautiful, now felt like a gilded cage. Nights became the hardest. Lying awake, staring at the ornate ceiling, she wondered how she could feel so alone in a house filled with people. Sometimes, she retreated to the small window seat in her private room, clutching a letter from her aunt, rereading lines of encouragement she'd once taken for granted. Arguments with Andrew turned cyclical. Whenever Emily tried to voice her distress, Andrew became defensive. Not angry, just resigned. "My mother's always been like this," he insisted. "She's set in her ways. We just need to give her time." Each conversation ended the same way, with Emily's feelings unacknowledged, her needs deferred. One afternoon, Margaret found Emily reading in the garden, the only time she truly felt herself. Sitting beside her, Margaret praised her dedication to family, then quietly slid in another request: that Emily refrain from wearing colorful dresses during public events, as they were too bold for the Harrington image. Margaret spoke softly, but her gaze brooked no argument. That evening, Margaret left a pair of muted, simple dresses on Emily's chair. "For your comfort," she noted. Slowly, even Emily's financial independence slipped away. Margaret recommended consolidating all household spending and, for convenience, suggested Emily hand over her checkbook. Emily hesitated, but Andrew, half listening, assured her it was just easier that way. "Mom likes to keep things organized, you know," he said. Reluctantly, Emily complied. The sense of powerlessness grew. Emily felt her world constricting, her identity replaced by a version crafted to Margaret's liking. Still, she clung to hope. Hope that with patience and compromise, this would change, and her marriage would regain its shared spark. But deep inside, a quiet voice began to question. If love meant losing herself, was it love at all? Was there any space for who she truly was in this family, where every choice, big or small, was second-guessed or outright controlled? That question stayed with her, echoing through the silent halls as the weight of invisible chains drew tighter around her heart. The line of endurance. For weeks, Emily moved through the Harrington estate as if through a labyrinth lined with glass, a world where every step was watched and each misstep quietly tallied. Margaret Harrington's grip on the household and on Emily in particular continued to tighten in ways both subtle and overt. What had begun as minor annoyances were now daily realities, controlling what Emily wore, who she spoke to, what decisions she was permitted to make, all cloaked as family customs or care. The rituals of married life, once a source of comfort, had transformed into daily performances, each one reminding her how little of herself still belonged to her. It wasn't always the grand gestures that cut the deepest. Sometimes, it was the accumulation of small indignities. A certain look from Margaret when Emily reached for her brightly colored scarf, or the sigh when she put a novel on the living room table. Emily's friends from her single life grew more distant, their messages shorter and less frequent. If she tried to call, the timing was inevitably inconvenient. Margaret would find a reason to summon her. Andrew would remember some urgent household matter, Or the housekeeper would appear at the door with a message, asking her to attend to Mrs. Harrington's request. On the rare days Emily managed to meet an old friend for coffee, she felt herself hesitate before sharing anything real. She feared being judged for seeming ungrateful, when from the outside, her life looked glamorous and secure. She learned to speak in generalities, describing garden parties and redecorating projects, not the gnawing sense of isolation or the uneven power dynamic ever present in her home. Privately, she wondered if any of them truly noticed her fade from their circles, or if she was just another friend, lost to the tyranny of married life. Inside the estate, Emily's world shrank to carefully delineated boundaries. Margaret kept a schedule for everyone and expected Emily to check in at regular intervals. There was a prescribed time for breakfast, for household management, for calls if they had to be made at all. Margaret would sometimes linger in the doorway just as Emily picked up her phone or opened the study door when she tried to write an email in private. Even the digital world felt surveilled. Margaret gently suggested Emily share her computer passwords for convenience, using language that gave no room for polite refusal. At first, Emily tried to rationalize these behaviors. Andrew, too, would insist, "It's just how my mother cares for her family. She wants us connected." But as weeks turned into months, and Margaret's intrusions grew more pointed, the narrative grew harder to believe. Emily became painfully aware that Margaret's care was wielded as a mask for control, and Andrew, a man she married believing he would protect and partner with her, had become, perhaps unconsciously, complicit in his mother's campaign. One gray afternoon, Emily received a letter from her aunt. Reading it by the window, she was overtaken with nostalgia for her childhood living room, where her aunt and uncle had encouraged her independence and resilience. The contrast between their gentle, empowering love and Margaret's suffocating affection struck her with particular force. That night, after another dinner at which Margaret had interrupted Emily at every opportunity and signaled approval or disapproval of each comment made by her daughter-in-law, Emily lay awake long past midnight. She began to question the compromise itself. How many pieces of herself was she willing to give away for the illusion of security? At what point did accommodation become surrender? Silence was supposed to keep the peace, but it left her with a persistent ache, a sense that she had forfeited something essential for the comfort of others. Still, Emily endured, clinging to hope. She believed things might change, that Andrew might finally see, that Margaret's dominance would soften, that time would allow space for Emily's own traditions. She told herself every marriage involved some sacrifice, some weathering of storms. But the family's manipulation grew bolder. One morning, Margaret approached Emily while she was organizing her checkbook. "Let me handle the family accounts. It's too much stress for you, darling," she said, not as a question, but as a gentle order. A week later, all account passwords had changed, and Emily's access to funds was routed through Margaret. Andrew dismissed her concern. "Mom is just more organized than we are," he said, brushing aside her growing unease. The ultimate breach came when Emily noticed Margaret keeping notes on her interactions with the house staff, as if monitoring her every move. The staff, once friendly, now avoided making eye contact with Emily when Margaret was in the room. When she tried to arrange a visit to see her aunt out of state, Margaret intervened, insisting it was a bad time for travel, and Andrew immediately echoed the sentiment. Margaret had begun to weigh in on the topic of children, dropping increasingly pointed hints about the right time and family values. One afternoon, While Emily quietly shared her hope of returning to work part-time, Margaret's smile faded. A child deserves a mother at home. The Harrington way is clear. Children come first. Her tone left no room for debate. Andrew, who had once admired Emily's passion for her career, grew reserved around the subject, as if he had been privately persuaded otherwise. Sometimes, Emily would retreat to her bedroom, the only space she could reliably claim as her own. There, she'd clutch an old family photo and cry quietly, careful to let the sound be absorbed by the thick drapes, afraid Margaret or Andrew would hear. The estate's beauty, the manicured lawns, sun-kissed rooms, and lake views, now felt alien, a daily reminder of everything she had exchanged for a promise that was slipping out of reach. Despite her pain, Emily rarely allowed herself anger. Instead, she channeled her energy into small acts of resistance, writing unsent letters, journaling the events of each day, carefully cataloging Margaret's words and actions, holding on to one or two phone numbers that hadn't yet fallen out of use. She knew these gestures might not change her current reality, but they preserved a sliver of autonomy. One evening, as Emily scrolled through photos on her phone, searching for evidence that she had not always felt this small, Margaret entered without knocking. "Don't you think it's time to put childish things away? Your family's in the past now. The Harringtons are your future." The words, uttered softly, struck Emily like a slap. That night, she lay in bed, asking herself how much longer she could accept such trespasses, and what line would finally mark the end of her endurance. Through it all, Emily remained committed to her marriage, at least outwardly. She continued to perform the expected rituals, keeping the household running and keeping up appearances for Andrew and Margaret's circle. But the cracks beneath, the raw, unacknowledged pain, were widening. By the beginning of the new season, Emily realized that her silence and compliance were not only trapping her, but enabling Margaret's power. Watching the first golden leaves drift across the water outside her window, she wondered if she would recognize herself when spring returned, or if by then the last remnants of Emily would have been erased under the relentless pressure to conform. In the shifting light of her room, she resolved, if only in the smallest, most private way, not to lose herself. She did not yet know how or when she would draw the line, but she knew the moment was coming, and when it did, her endurance would become something else entirely. The start of resistance. The moment Emily realized she could no longer endure without risking the loss of her very self, something inside her quietly shifted. It wasn't a dramatic upheaval, not at first, but a subtle hardening, a coalescing of the small rebellions she'd nursed in secret corners of her mind. She began to see, with unsettling clarity, the extent of Margaret's control and Andrew's complicity. And with this awareness, a thin thread of resolve wound itself around her heart. Emily's first steps toward resistance were invisible to everyone but herself. They were private, almost instinctual, born not from anger, but from necessity. A stubborn desire to reclaim the parts of her life that had been systematically erased. Each act, no matter how small, became a way to stake a claim for her own existence within the sprawling Harrington estate. She started with observation. Emily paid close attention to the rhythms of the household. She listened for the soft click of Margaret's heels in the hallway, memorized the times staff slipped upstairs to deliver reports, and noticed which phone lines were monitored or left suspiciously unclaimed. As the days slipped by, she learned the patterns of surveillance, the subtle glances between the housekeeper and Margaret. The way Andrew's tone shifted if a conversation veered too close to confrontation. These details mattered. They were clues in a quiet war. Emily began keeping a journal, not just of her feelings, but of facts, dates and times of conversations, details of comments that felt designed to diminish her. All the moments her independence was countered by a smile or a sigh. She cataloged every instance Margaret intercepted her calls, altered her plans, or refused her requests. The act of writing gave Emily both validation and proof. Her reality no longer something she could be gaslit into doubting, but a pattern forming on the page. When Margaret demanded the family accounts be consolidated, Emily unobtrusively copied financial statements, emailing them to a secured address she set up for herself. She gathered documents related to the estate, wills, trust papers, and expense invoices, photographing them discreetly with her phone under the pretense of reorganizing drawers. She saved every message and email in which Andrew parroted Margaret's orders, every casual text reminding her to defer to Mom's wishes. Each digital scrap became a tile in the mosaic of truth she was assembling. Margaret, ever vigilant, sensed the subtle shift in Emily, but dismissed it as simple withdrawal. If anything, she saw Emily's new coolness as a sign that her influence was finally complete. She pushed harder, scrutinizing Emily's appearance, controlling her outings with even more precision, involving Andrew in every minor decision. Andrew, for his part, grew more irritable, more distant, blaming Emily for tension in the house, but never tracing the true source. In her solitude, Emily sought out moments of genuine joy, short walks at dawn before the others rose, hidden corners of the estate where she could read or simply breathe. She took to quietly practicing yoga in her room to steady her nerves. She reconnected, cautiously, with old friends by sending postcards from a local coffee shop, sometimes using the names of mutual acquaintances rather than her own to avoid detection. It amazed her how adept she'd become at living a hidden second life. Some clues pointed to deeper schemes. One afternoon, while searching for a misplaced book in Margaret's home office, Emily discovered a manila folder labeled with her maiden name. Inside were photocopies of her personal records, her university transcripts, old medical reports, even information about her parents' accident. A cold wave of dread passed through her. She replaced everything exactly as she'd found it, burning the details into her memory and jotting them down that night in her journal. The scope of Margaret's invasion reached far beyond meddling. It bordered on obsession. Emily knew she needed allies. She reached out first to her aunt, framing her messages as innocuous updates. Missing Seattle. Would love your favorite blueberry pie recipe. But embedded codes in the phrasing, using details only her aunt would recognize as requests for help. Her aunt, wise and discreet, responded in kind, suggesting lawyers and counselors she trusted without raising suspicions. With mounting evidence, Emily began lightly researching her legal options. She explored divorce, spousal rights, and custody law in Washington state. Bookmarked websites and articles were kept on a hidden browser profile. She watched videos late at night, learning how to collect and preserve admissible evidence and how to safely prepare for court. She recorded voice memos on her phone of Margaret's most invasive conversations, saving backups in the cloud under innocuous file names. The emotional turmoil was immense. Each step forward demanded the suppression of anxiety, a constant vigilance that bordered on exhaustion. Emily carried herself with practiced composure, maintaining the veneer of calm necessary to avoid scrutiny, even as her internal world roiled with doubt and fear. There were nights when she sat pressed against the cold window, staring out across Lake Washington, tears streaking her face as she steeled herself for what was to come. The thought of leaving Andrew and the life she'd dreamed of was like tearing out an old, precious photograph. But clinging to that dream, she knew, would only leave her faceless in the picture. Margaret, sensing restlessness but not risk, began planning a family trip to Europe for the summer. A spectacle of tradition meant to further isolate Emily from the few connections she'd managed to keep. Privately, Emily resolved this would be her final performance. She met each round of instructions with polite acceptance while quietly tightening her preparations, copying important files onto a flash drive and arranging for valuables. Her mother's locket, old journals, to be quietly mailed to her aunt's address. Emily's resistance took a final, crucial form. She started saying no, not loudly, never in a way that could be twisted as belligerence, but firmly and without apology. When Margaret insisted she cut her hair to better suit the Harrington look, Emily replied, "Thank you, but I'm comfortable as I am." When Andrew, echoing his mother's worry about appearances, suggested she stop meeting her friends, Emily asked, "Is that really best for us, or for your mother's peace of mind?" Each soft refusal was a drop in Margaret's bucket of control, eroding its foundation grain by grain. Privately, Emily rehearsed what she would someday say in court. She practiced telling the story aloud when no one could hear, reciting the details in cool, measured tones, never pleading, never apologizing for her own existence. She visualized sitting on the witness stand, explaining each step she'd taken, every indignity in every act of courage. By the time spring painted the gardens in color, the outlines of her escape were clear. She had documented, planned, confided, and made arrangements with trusted contacts. Still, each day felt like balancing on a thin wire. One wrong step, and she knew Margaret would exert every ounce of her power to stop her. But Emily's path had narrowed to only one possible direction, and her spirit, battered but unbroken, steadied for the storm ahead. She had crossed the line inside herself, from silent endurance to active resistance, knowing now that the only way to reclaim her life was to fight with every quiet weapon at her disposal. The day was coming when the world would finally see the truth, and she would no longer be just Mrs. Harrington, but Emily once again, whole, fiercely resilient, and free. The eruption of the quiet volcano. From the outside, the Harrington estate seemed unchanged as spring deepened into early summer. The gardens grew lush, the household bustled as usual, and the city's wealthiest still graced the parties held on the manicured lawn. Yet, beneath the carefully maintained surface, the tension that had simmered for so long inside Emily was about to break through. Propelled by injustice upon injustice, humiliations no longer endurable, and the slow build of courage that had, at last, caught flame. It began with a summons. One morning, Emily was called to Margaret's study, a room Emily had always regarded with faint dread. Filled with family portraits and polished, old wood furniture exuding the weight of tradition. Margaret sat behind her desk, lips thin, hands folded on a stack of documents. Andrew entered a moment later, his face unreadable. Emily sensed the gravity before a word was spoken. Margaret's first words felt rehearsed. "Emily, your commitment to our family is about to be tested." The elder woman slid a thick envelope across the desk. "For the sake of clarity and our legacy, I need you to sign these documents." There was no warmth in her tone, only the cold assurance of someone who expected obedience. Emily opened the envelope with steady hands. Inside were legal documents, a transfer of Emily's financial rights as a Harrington, clauses limiting her access to any family property, and most chillingly, a section concerning future children she and Andrew might have, a pre-designated guardianship that would place decision-making solely with Margaret and her counsel. She stared at the text, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would be audible. This isn't just about money or the house, Emily managed. You want to take my future children away from me before they're even born? Margaret's voice softened, but the steel remained. A family's legacy must be protected by those who understand it. We are bound by duty, Emily. This isn't personal. It's the Harrington way. Andrew didn't meet Emily's gaze. She sensed in an instant that, regardless of whatever arguments they'd had in private, he had capitulated fully to his mother. For a fleeting moment, Emily weighed compliance. One more signature, one more surrender. But years' worth of eroded boundaries and lost freedoms crashed through her. All the silent sacrifices, the manipulations cloaked as tradition, the slow theft of her autonomy. She saw them laid out before her, irrefutable, damning, and soul-crushing. Her answer was clear. "I will not sign this," Emily said, her voice trembling at first, then gaining strength. "This is not love. This is not a family. You want a servant or an heir, not a partner or a daughter-in-law." A muscle flickered in Margaret's jaw. "If you refuse, you will make things very difficult for everyone. The family's reputation, Andrew's future. Your concern for reputation has already destroyed everything you claim to value," Emily replied, her composure returning. "I will not participate in my own erasure." Andrew flinched, but said nothing. The impact of her refusal was immediate and severe. In the days that followed, Margaret froze Emily out completely. Every household staff member avoided her as if an invisible order had passed down the line. Andrew became withdrawn, communicating with Emily through clipped phrases or leaving the house for hours, sometimes days. The warmth that had once existed between them had turned to ice. The social world followed suit. Invitations dried up. Old friends from the city stopped calling, having clearly heard a story much different than the truth. Rumors trickled back to Emily. Whispers of her supposed instability. Stories about her ungratefulness. Even hints she wasn't loyal to Andrew, all designed to isolate her further. But for the first time, instead of despair, Emily felt a strange relief. The facade had crumbled. The truth was out in the open. Margaret made one last attempt to bring Emily to her senses. This time, she did not bother with subtlety. She called a family meeting, the air heavy with expectation. Andrew's siblings, rarely present before, appeared somber and silent, clearly briefed beforehand. Margaret spoke as if issuing a royal decree. "Emily, if you will not uphold this family's values, we must consider a formal separation. Andrew, you understand this is necessary for our legacy?" Andrew's voice, hollow and tired, answered, "Yes, Mother." Turning to Emily, Margaret added, "If you ever wish to see your own family again, or even stay in Seattle, you had better cooperate. I have the means to make things very hard for you." The room seemed to close in. Yet this threat, rather than intimidating Emily, unlocked the last reserves of her resolve. Standing, she looked around the room, making eye contact with each face. "No more. I will not be bullied, stalked, or silenced. This stops here." Soon after, Emily packed a small bag and left the estate. taking only her essential items and the evidence she had so painstakingly gathered over the past months. She checked into a modest hotel on the other side of the town, used her own small savings account that Margaret had never fully usurped, and called her aunt. The call was tearful and tense, but also purposeful. Emily shared everything: the surveillance, the coercion, the attempt to seize not only present rights, but her hypothetical children. Her aunt, horrified, put her in touch with a seasoned attorney about family law and domestic coercion in Washington state. Within 2 days, Emily was meeting with the attorney, transferring all her notes, files, and recordings. The lawyer assured her it was more than enough to prove psychological abuse in systematic isolation. "We will file for a protective order, and you will not have to return to that house," she promised. Even with legal wheels in motion, Emily's fear lingered. Margaret and Andrew launched a public relations campaign to destroy her credibility, painting her as unstable, petty, a gold digger betraying her vows. On social media and in private circles, the Harringtons controlled the narrative, at least for a while. Emily, coached by her legal team, kept silent in public, letting documentation and fact speak for her. A week after leaving, a process server delivered legal filings to the Harrington estate. The war was now official, and the consequences would be fought not in wood-paneled drawing rooms, but in court. Emily had made her stand, speaking out forcefully for her dignity and rights, and for the right of all women to be seen, heard, and respected, no matter how powerful the family or alluring the promise of luxury. She stood that night by her hotel window, watching the city lights blur in the rain, shoulders squared and heart steady. For the first time in years, Emily's reflection staring back at her looked utterly her own. The volcano inside had finally erupted, not in violence or rage, but in unbending resolve, honesty, and hope. Tomorrow, the battle would continue, but tonight, Emily slept without fear, knowing at last that she had chosen herself. Turning the tide. Emily stared at her reflection in the small hotel mirror, the deep circles under her eyes, the wary but determined set of her mouth. The last few days had been a blur of legal consultations, hurried phone calls, and the relentless ache of uncertainty. Yet, beneath the exhaustion was a current of quiet power, a sharp contrast to the meek numbness that had defined her days at the Harrington estate. After meeting with her attorney and sharing the thick dossier of evidence she had amassed, Emily found herself feeling something akin to hope. For months, she had meticulously documented every restriction, every manipulative word, every conversation where her autonomy had been chipped away. Now, her evidence became a powerful ally. Pages of dates, transcripts, photos, and secret recordings assembled into a clear record of coercive control. Margaret and Andrew were caught off guard by the abrupt escalation. They had grown accustomed to Emily's compliance, her politeness, her tendency to shrink back rather than engage in open confrontation. The news that Emily had not only left, but was pressing legal charges, forced them to scramble. The Harringtons' lawyer, a silver-haired man more skilled in estate disputes than domestic litigation, visited the estate twice a day, meetings growing longer and more heated. Meanwhile, Emily and her aunt strategized with her new legal team. Marissa, her lead lawyer, was experienced in cases of emotional and psychological abuse, fiercely intelligent and never patronizing. With every new meeting, Emily learned more about her rights, about how years of manipulation in the name of family honor constituted a pattern of emotional confinement recognized by Washington state law. Her hurt was being translated into hard, actionable arguments. The legal process moved quickly. Marissa filed motions for protective orders, froze joint accounts to prevent financial retaliation, and delivered a formal request for discovery, a demand that the Harringtons turn over communication records, surveillance logs from the estate, and household expense accounts. This proactive stance kept Margaret and Andrew off balance. In court filings, they attempted to paint Emily as unstable, using the same tired accusations that had once cowed her. But every claim was methodically countered with fact, not only by Emily's documentation, but by the growing support of outsiders who had quietly witnessed Margaret's suffocating influence over the years. Some of the house staff, finally free from Margaret's immediate gaze, reached out to Emily's lawyers. Several agreed to provide confidential depositions, describing Margaret's instructions about what information to withhold from Emily, how to monitor her communications, and how staff requests were funneled through Margaret, intentionally undermining Emily's position as lady of the house. These voices added weight to Emily's case, transforming her story from one woman's private misery into a portrait of systemic abuse. Word spread through Seattle's social circles. Old friends learned the truth of what Emily had endured, not through angry rants or social media tirades, but through carefully crafted statements from her legal team. Her attorney made it clear, this was not a simple marital dispute. This was about a cultured, respected family leveraging generational power to erase the independence of a woman they had promised to welcome. The public began to watch, not just with curiosity, but with empathy that surprised even Emily herself. Margaret reacted as she always had, by attempting to seize control. She organized a press conference, standing with Andrew at her side in front of a bank of microphones, issuing statements about family values and the pain of a tragic misunderstanding. She painted herself as a victim, insisting that Emily was acting irrationally, coached by outsiders. Andrew, face pale and gaze unfocused, echoed her words, almost robotically. But the impact was undercut by the momentum of the evidence gathering in Emily's favor. Online, commentators and journalists began to raise difficult questions about coercion and control in powerful households. Inside the whirlwind, Emily soldiered on. She collaborated daily with Marissa and her team, organizing the vast body of evidence into a chronology. Text messages where Margaret overrode Emily's decisions, videos showing Margaret denying Emily's right to phone calls with family, bank statements that proved her financial access had been systematically curtailed months before. She recorded a full written testimony, her emotions raw but anchored by fact, explaining how every tradition Margaret once lauded had become a chain, and how even Andrew's affection had been weaponized to reinforce her isolation. Emily also maintained contact with the staff from her old life, managers from the bookstore, school friends, even customers who recalled her kindness and strength. Some wrote letters of support describing how Emily had changed since moving to the estate, growing distant, sad, and withdrawn. Their words painted a mosaic of transformation, proof that the unstable woman painted by Margaret was in fact a victim of an invisible, insidious system. The biggest surprise came when Andrew's elder sister, Clara, contacted Marissa. Clara had spent much of her adult life away from the familial orbit, estranged by Margaret's control and unwilling to submit as Andrew had. She knew, better than anyone, the cost of honoring the Harrington legacy. In a brave move, Clara submitted a sworn statement about her childhood, confirming that Margaret's pattern of manipulation was long-standing and intentional. With Claire's testimony, the tapestry of evidence became undeniable. The pressure mounted on the Harrington family. Their lawyer, recognizing the shifting ground, advised settling. Margaret refused. She launched a barrage of counter-allegations. But the evidence overwhelmed her efforts at spin. Each legal blow delivered by Emily's team was measured, rooted in verifiable fact, and immune to emotional blackmail. Emily, for her part, began to feel lighter for the first time in years. Away from the estate, she rediscovered pleasures she had forgotten. Making her own decisions about what to eat, reading late into the night without interruption, walking through city parks, listening to the easy hum of freedom. She saw her aunt more often, sometimes sitting over steaming mugs of tea just to laugh and cry in equal measure. Slowly, she started reconnecting with herself, journaling, sketching, and preparing for the court struggle ahead, not as a victim, but as a woman who had finally claimed agency over her own future. The groundwork was laid. Emily, armed not just with evidence, but with the hard-won self-respect she thought she'd lost, looked ahead to the next stage, the public legal confrontation that would decide everything. In those moments alone at night, city lights shining through her hotel window, she felt a quiet gratitude for the pain that had forced her to transform. This was not merely self-defense. It was a reclamation, a forceful turning of the tide against those who had confused love with possession, who thought the legacy of their name was worth more than another person's soul. Emily had crossed a chasm, and as the date for the trial approached, she understood at last. She was not alone, and she would never again be silent. The world was watching. Now, her story would finally be told. The legal battle. The courtroom was nothing like the grand halls of the Harrington estate, yet it seethed with the same undercurrent of power and expectation. Sunlight filtered through the high, dusty windows. Rows of benches stretched to the back, occupied by reporters, onlookers, and the occasional socialite who recognized a Harrington scandal as must-see theater. Emily sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, hands pressed together in her lap, every inch of her projecting the poise she had so carefully reconstructed in the weeks since leaving the estate. To the right sat Marissa, her attorney, her bright eyes alert and purposefully unblinking as she reviewed a stack of evidence folders one last time. On the opposing side loomed the Harrington family, a tableau of wealth in tailored suits and pearl necklaces. Margaret had chosen a deep navy dress and wore her years like armor, her lips pressed in a permanent, self-righteous line. Andrew, pale and tired, kept his gaze fixed on the wood grain of the table, as if hoping to disappear between the cracks. When the judge entered, the room snapped to attention. You could hear the nervous shuffling of paper, the not-so-quiet breaths of anticipation from the gallery, and the low, metallic sound of the gavel marking the official beginning. This was a courtroom built for public drama, and Emily felt the weight of 100 eyes on her as each party was announced and the charges read aloud. Psychological abuse, marital coercion, wrongful deprivation of property, and, most sensitively, the issue of child custody, prescient in legal filings, even if no children existed yet. Marissa opened the proceedings with a measured, powerful statement. She described, in precise yet devastating detail, how family tradition had been weaponized to silence, isolate, and subjugate her client. She painted a picture of Emily not as a gold digger or a troublemaker, but as a woman systematically erased by the very people who'd promised her a family. Marissa's voice never wavered as she quoted the journal entries Emily had made at midnight, the medical reports of stress-related illnesses, and records of her communications being intercepted or abruptly cut off. Watching Marissa work, Emily was awestruck. Here was the defense she'd dreamed of, but never believed she'd have. A professional voice to say, her story is real. Her pain is valid. Here is the proof. When it was her turn to take the stand, Emily walked with calm determination. She answered each question with honesty and restraint, refusing to embellish and never veering into bitterness. She relayed the events not as an injured party seeking vengeance, but as a survivor describing the slow suffocation of her rights. She spoke of how Margaret, behind her courtesies, had always held a silent leash, of how Andrew's affection, once a comfort, had become a conduit for control. She recounted how even the house staff became Margaret's instruments, enforcing rules that rendered Emily a guest in her own life. The defense tried to turn the narrative on its head. Margaret's attorney cross-examined with polite skepticism, pushing at every detail, suggesting that Emily's emotional accounts were exaggerations or misunderstandings born of stress in an unfamiliar environment. Margaret herself took the stand, framing her actions as a mother's care to protect family traditions, her voice thick with practiced remorse. When asked about watching Emily's communications, Margaret demurred, insisting it was only to help her adjust. Andrew, in his testimony, avoided direct blame, but repeated his mother's narrative, painting Emily as someone who struggled with the demands of their social station, a kindly but fragile outsider. But the mounting tide of evidence was undeniable. Marissa called on members of the house staff who, under oath and with newfound courage, confirmed the extent of Margaret's control. Emails intercepted at her instruction, phone calls reported, freedom of movement quietly curtailed. One housekeeper even described how she'd been forced to say no to Emily's requests, unless cleared by Mrs. Harrington. Old friends of Emily's described her personality shift. A once vibrant, self-assured woman made anxious and withdrawn by her life at the estate. Clara, Andrew's elder sister, delivered the turning point. Taking the stand with a firm voice, she told the court, "I left for the very reasons Emily is here today. My mother's love is conditional. It's about power, not family. I stand with Emily because I know she's telling the truth." The courtroom murmured. The tide was visibly shifting. The cross-examinations grew tense. Marissa parried every challenge, unfurling documented timestamps, financial records, and witness statements into a web that suffocated the opposition's narrative. The judge, a woman with a reputation for impatience with family drama, made careful notes, her gaze steady but not unsympathetic as Emily recounted the cruel moment she was asked to sign away her rights to future children. Days passed in a blur of testimony and legal argument. On the outside, the trials were covered in the media with all the usual speculation. Some painted Emily as a homewrecker, and others a quiet heroine for modern women. Emily learned to ignore headlines, to focus only on the facts and the slow, daily reclaiming of her voice. During breaks, Emily would find a quiet bench in the hallway, close her eyes, and breathe deeply. Sometimes Marissa sat beside her, offering a hand squeeze or a reassuring reminder. "They don't get to write your story. You do." Each day, Emily grew stronger, her voice on the stand steadier, her posture looser, even in the presence of those who once made her small. Final arguments arrived. Marissa laid out the narrative arc plainly. This is not about money or social standing. This is about power, in the right of every human being to live and love freely, without coercion, even in the shadows of wealth and tradition. She concluded with a call to restore to Emily the one thing that had been systematically denied, her agency. The opposing counsel, ever cordial, argued that tradition was not abuse and that miscommunication lay at the root of Emily's struggle. But the contrast was clear. One side asked for dignity and freedom, the other for preservation of a system built on silence. As the court recessed before the verdict, Emily sat with her aunt on a courthouse step, rain pattering gently on the stone. She realized the outcome mattered, but so did the process. On this battlefield, she had found her courage, forged her strength, and reclaimed her name. Win or lose, Emily was no longer invisible. And somewhere inside, she knew the world had changed with her. An unexpected victory. The day the verdict was to be announced, the city was shrouded in a chilled autumn mist. Emily awoke before sunrise, restless and taut with anticipation. She had slept in fits, her mind flickering through memories, some happy, most burdened by the weight of all that had transpired. As she watched the gray sky brighten over the city, she was keenly aware that this moment would mark the culmination of not just months of legal struggle, but years of silent endurance. Arriving at the courthouse, Emily found the usual crowd waiting. Media vans were parked at odd angles along the curb. Cameras jostled and microphones bristled, hoping to catch the first reaction. She ignored the swirling questions as she climbed the marble steps, focusing instead on each measured breath. Her aunt met her at the main entrance, embracing her briefly. "Whatever happens, you've reclaimed yourself," her aunt whispered, and Emily squeezed her hand, holding on to the truth of those words. The courtroom itself felt colder than before. The judge's bench was already occupied, papers neatly stacked. Margaret and Andrew were seated with their legal team, maintaining the same calculated composure they'd worn throughout the proceedings, though Emily could sense a nervous flicker in Andrew's eyes. Margaret never looked her way. Emily took her seat beside Marissa, her attorney, who quietly offered a reassuring nod. A hush fell as the clerk read out the formalities. And then, with "practiced authority," the judge began. What followed was not just the reading of a verdict, but also a careful, impassioned explanation of the court's reasoning. The judge spoke directly to the heart of the matter, slicing through years of invisible coercion, and summed up fears. "There is a difference," the judge intoned, "between family tradition and domination. The court has reviewed extensive evidence of systematic isolation, financial control, and emotional manipulation inflicted upon Mrs. Emily Carter Harrington by both her husband and his mother. No tradition, however long-standing, justifies the erosion of personal dignity and liberty." For a suspended breath, the entire room seemed to freeze. Then the judge pronounced the findings. Emily was granted full control over her personal assets, and legal protections were put in place to restore her financial independence. Most astonishingly, for the event of future custody, should children ever be born, sole guardianship would remain with Emily unless demonstrable evidence of unfit parenting arose. Lastly, and perhaps most vindicating, the judge formally admonished Margaret and Andrew for their roles in the abuse, mandating they attend extensive counseling as part of the court's orders. It took several moments for reality to settle over Emily. She felt as if air she hadn't realized she was holding had finally rushed from her lungs. Her aunt reached over and squeezed her hand. Marissa beamed. For the first time, the faces gathered in the gallery, many of whom had regarded her as an outsider, a troublemaker, turned toward her with respect. even admiration. Margaret recovered first, rising sharply and gathering her bag as if to reclaim control through sheer performance. Andrew simply looked hollow, his shoulders slouched, the remnants of defiance gone from his posture. Emily watched them go, without triumph or malice. The justice she felt was not about retribution, but restoration. After court adjourned, reporters immediately swarmed. Marissa shielded Emily, briefly addressing the press. "This is a victory for dignity, truth, and the rights of all individuals not to be defined or erased by the circumstances into which they marry. We hope the court's decision brings awareness and change beyond this case." Emily herself, exhausted yet anchored, offered only a brief statement. "I stood up, not just for myself, but for every person who has ever felt invisible. Recovery is slow, but freedom is worth every step." The press coverage was overwhelming in the following days, painting Emily both as a symbol for change and, in some circles, as a controversial figure. She tried not to follow every headline, but learned to accept, sometimes with humor, sometimes with weary patience, that her name had become larger than her individual story. Back at her modest apartment, life began to shift into a quieter, steadier rhythm. Her finances restored, Emily could pay her own rent and no longer lived in fear of every purchase being scrutinized. More importantly, she experienced a gradual lightening within. Laughter felt genuine again. A long, hot shower felt like a gift. And her sleep, though still patchy, was no longer laced with dread. Emily's relationship with her aunt deepened. Their conversations were now colored with warmth, mutual respect, and even moments of levity. Friends who had distanced themselves began to reach out, some to apologize, some only to reconnect, sensing it was finally safe. Over coffee one afternoon, her closest friend remarked, "I barely recognize the woman you were in that mansion. It's like the lights come back." Still, victory did not erase trauma. Some nights, Emily would wake from dreams in which Margaret's cold voice echoed. She remained cautious in public, always aware that Margaret or Andrew, or anyone influenced by their orbit, might try to twist the narrative again. But the difference now was stark. Emily recognized her own worth and trusted her resolve to draw boundaries. In time, she found herself at a new beginning. Rather than returning to her old marketing job, Emily decided to redirect her experience into advocacy. She began volunteering at a legal clinic for women experiencing coercion and abuse. Her understanding was painfully intimate, and her calm presence had a reassuring effect on those terrified of taking their first stand. She wasn't a savior. She recalled too clearly how important self-emancipation was. But she could be a guide, a listener, an ally. 6 months after the trial, Emily stood in a sunlit conference room, presenting her story to a group of social workers and lawyers. Her voice, sure now and steady, carried a message not of bitterness, but resilience. "Freedom doesn't always make me feel fearless, but this freedom is mine, and the fear is not stronger than the truth." Outside, the seasons had shifted again. Emily often took long walks, noticing details she once missed. The changing color of leaves, the laughter of children in a nearby park, the simple beauty of ordinary life. She understood that her battle hadn't ended with the court's decision. Healing was a journey, sometimes measured in inches, sometimes in great leaps. But Emily's victory, a victory she once dared not dream, had reshaped her world. She was no longer the woman waiting for permission to be herself. She would never again be defined by anyone else's legacy. And with every new sunrise, she built her own. In her heart, Emily carried a quiet gratitude for the battle she had fought and won. And when she looked in the mirror, she finally saw not just a survivor, but a woman wholly, unexpectedly, and gloriously free. The finale in the lesson. As the year ebbed away, and Seattle's trees surrendered their last leaves to the wind, Emily Carter found herself navigating the uncharted territory of life after survival. The noisy drama of the Harrington saga had faded from the city's gossip columns, making space for other headlines. But for Emily, the aftermath was quieter and more transformative than any storm that came before. For the first time since her parents' death, Emily woke each morning unburdened by the weight of other people's expectations. No more did her life orbit around the moods of Andrew, the pronouncements of Margaret, or the rigid customs of a family built on power and appearance. Instead, her days unfolded with modest joys and hard-won freedom. She moved into a sunlit apartment not far from Lake Union, a cozy space cluttered with books, plants, and the vibrant art her aunt had encouraged her to rediscover. Each object was an act of reclamation: a painting scrawled late at night, a worn journal filled with reflections, photographs of her childhood home. Emily embraced solitude, not as a hole to be filled, but as a garden she could finally tend on her own terms. Yet healing, she realized, was not a simple arc from pain to peace. There were mornings when she woke anxious, heart racing over some phantom echo of the past. Nightmares, sometimes revisited. The chilling coldness of Margaret's voice, the sound of her own laughter ringing hollow in the Harrington mansion, the sensation of being watched or manipulated. But Emily had learned new habits. She'd mastered the subtle art of reaching for comfort, whether it meant calling her aunt for a long talk, writing in her journal until her thoughts quieted, or sitting by the window to watch the city lights dance on the water. More than anything, Emily learned to trust herself again. The old Emily, the hopeful girl who believed her future could be both bright and self-made, had not been lost. She'd simply been buried under years of adaptation and compromise, waiting for a chance to breathe again. Emily's circle expanded naturally and gently. At first, it was just her aunt, always steady, always wise. Then some of her closest friends, many of whom had drifted away during her marriage, began to return cautiously. Some came with apologies or even tears, unsure of how to make amends for their distance. Emily forgave easily, not out of obligation, but from an understanding of how subtle and powerful the forces of manipulation could be. She let old wounds heal slowly, new trust sprouting between shared confidences and honest conversations. When asked to speak at a community event on coercive control and emotional abuse, Emily hesitated. The thought of standing before strangers, laying bare the most painful chapters of her life, frightened her. But she remembered the overwhelming isolation she'd felt, the fear that no one would believe her story, the loneliness of thinking she was the only one. She knew that silence, more than anything, allowed patterns of abuse to persist across generations. So, with trembling hands but unwavering resolve, she told her story. She described the slow suffocation disguised as tradition, the subtle yet persistent gaslighting, and the way her identity had been eroded not by violence, but by the constant assertion of another's will. Her voice shook, but she did not falter. Afterward, several women approached her, some quietly, some with tears in their eyes, thanking her for voicing an experience they had never been able to articulate themselves. This marked a turning point. Emily joined a network of advocates and lawyers working to protect women in similar circumstances. She volunteered at local shelters and clinics, sometimes late into the night, offering empathy instead of empty advice. Her experience had taught her that healing could not be rushed nor prescribed, that every survivor's path was crooked and unique. Professionally, Emily channeled her marketing expertise into campaigns promoting awareness of emotional coercion, a form of abuse often overlooked in both law and society. She collaborated with social workers, produced video testimonials, and developed resources for those too afraid to seek help. In every meeting, she brought the clarity and composed tenacity she'd fought so hard to reclaim. Privately, there were still difficult days. Sometimes, Emily walked past a window display or overheard a piece of music that transported her back to a gilded cage. She'd feel anger at herself, at Margaret, at Andrew, at a culture too ready to excuse abuse as family matters. But the anger faded, replaced by gratitude for her own resilience and for the unexpected allies who had helped her escape. One afternoon, while reorganizing her bookshelf, Emily discovered the battered copy of Jane Eyre she had carried from her childhood home, through college, across her studio apartment, and, finally, to that daunting mansion on Lake Washington. Inside, she'd once scrawled a favorite line, "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will." Emily traced those words with her fingertips, smiling at their renewed truth. Her journey, full of heartbreak, courage, setbacks, and triumph, had reforged her. She no longer measured herself by others' approval, nor feared solitude. She knew deeply, almost instinctively, that true happiness could not be bestowed, only cultivated within. Though Emily's story had become public, she continued to guard her peace. She declined most interviews and politely refused requests to set the record straight. She had no desire to relive the drama or to become a symbol. Instead, she chose her own narrative, a life of purpose, connection, service, and simple pleasures. Perhaps the greatest lesson lay in the gentle unlearning of old myths. The idea that love always conquers, that compromise is a virtue without limits, that wealth or legacy can stand in for genuine care. Emily came to understand that boundaries are not signs of selfishness, but acts of profound self-respect. She learned that asking for help didn't mean weakness, that there is immense courage in admitting vulnerability, in reaching out when the darkness feels too dense. Somewhere along the winding path of recovery, Emily made a quiet vow to see herself with kindness, to hold space for imperfection, to extend compassion even when memory threatened to harden her heart. In the mirror, she began to see not just a survivor, but a woman reshaped and refined, stronger, wiser, and more whole for every scar. And so, as another year dawned, Emily stood rooted in gratitude, not for the suffering, but for the strength found on the other side. Her journey, from orphaned hope through dazzling dreams into the crucible of control and out again, had become both cautionary tale and quiet celebration. She understood now. Liberation is a process, not a destination. Happiness does not arrive fully formed, but grows day by day in choices made for oneself and in the steady conviction that no past, however painful, can dictate the terms of the future. In helping others, Emily found her own healing deepening. And as she watched the sunrise on another ordinary, extraordinary day, She knew her story had only just begun, a testament to the quiet power of selfhood and the undimmed possibility waiting at the heart of every hard-won new beginning.